Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Timely Topics webinar titled Environmental Injustice, Why Should We Care? I'm Cheryl Tung, President of the League of Women Voters of Wake County. Before we get started, I have just a few announcements regarding upcoming League activities and events. Recognizing that June is Gun Violence Awareness Month, our latest DEI roundtable discussion will discuss the relationship of racism to gun violence. This roundtable discussion is not a lecture, but will be an interactive facilitated discussion. As a reminder, all of our DEI roundtable discussions are open to any League member in North Carolina. Our next League Lit event is on July 8th, and we'll discuss the book Breath, The New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor. Finally, I'd like to put in a plug for Women's Equality Day on August 26th. This is the League's major fundraiser, and the Women's Equality Day Committee has been working overtime to make this a fabulous in-person event this year. Again, we will recognize all the hardworking women elected officials in Wake County. This event is open to members and supporters of the League. You can register for this event on our website, LWV-Wake.org. And please consider purchasing a sponsorship to help support the League's important work. You can find more information about all of our activities and events at our website, again, LWV-Wake.org. And if you're not already a member of the League, you can join online at our website. And before we begin, I want to briefly explain how we are using the Zoom platform for this webinar. Except for the presenters, everyone is muted and you're not on video. We're not using the chat feature in Zoom. Instead, please type your questions in the Q&A screen. Our moderators will be monitoring the Q&A screen throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, the speaker will be asked your questions. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Please don't wait till the end of the presentation to submit your questions. Cheryl Keaton, our Timely Topics Committee co-chair, will monitor the questions submitted and will serve as our moderator for the Q&A segment. This webinar is being recorded and in the next few days will appear on the LWV-Wake's YouTube channel. Now I'd like to turn the program over to our other Timely Topics co-chair, Catherine Wilkinson, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to introduce Amin Davis. He is an environmental scientist who holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Marine Biology and Environmental Science from Hampton University and a Master of Zoology degree from NC State. He has over 20 years of professional experience conducting environmental and waste resource management work in public, private, and nonprofit sectors across 9 states. His work has included watershed improvement and restoration activities, the integration of geographic information systems, and regulatory permitting coordination. He has been employed by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality since 2008 and is currently a community grant manager for the Division of Water Resources. Amin has long applied his professional experience to nonprofit volunteer work in Southeast Raleigh and also serves as a board member of Partners for Environmental Justice. With regard for his accomplishments, I am pleased to welcome Amin to this session of Timely Topics.
Okay, can you hear me now? I just want to make sure y'all can hear me before I get started.
We can hear you.
Great, great. Well, Catherine, I appreciate your introduction, and I also would like to thank Eva Taglioni and Jackie Giordano with the League's Environment Committee for inviting me to speak to you all this afternoon about this very important topic. I'm also honored to share this virtual stage with Veronica Carter, who I heard speak about her EJ experiences at the annual Water Resources Research Institute annual conference earlier this year. So I was inspired after hearing her, and I know that you all will be as well once you have to hear what she has to say. So with that, I'm going to get started. And okay, so I'm warning you up front that I have a lot of slides in this presentation, so I'm going to run through them very quickly. However, many of the slides are visuals and graphics to provide context, and a PDF of this presentation will be made available to you all after this program, so that you don't have to worry about feverishly taking notes or trying to keep up with everything I say. So let me just back up. So yeah, these are the things that I'm going to briefly go through in the next 30 minutes or so. We'll just get into it. So I'm just going to start off by giving y'all a moment to just look at this information so that we can kind of be grounded in what environmental injustice and environmental justice is. I specifically want to highlight the information in red text because environmental injustices a lot of times are rooted in institutional discriminatory practices and policies that have been going on for many years and obviously adversely impact communities of color. Environmental justice deals with the meaningful involvement, fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, or other things. And the graphic on the bottom right is, I'm sure some of you have heard that statement about if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I stole this from the NC Environmental Justice Network, but really, it's really important a lot of times that, you know, communities are not part of the process when there are actions or activities that are done in their communities and that may adversely impact them. And the role that Partners for Environmental Justice, which is my organization I'm involved with, as well as other nonprofits and individuals, we try to serve as advocates for those who may not have the capacity or the time to be meaningfully engaged in some of these activities that may adversely impact them. So this is just a little context or history of Partners for Environmental Justice. So our organization was created in the Rochester the Rochester Heights community in Southeast Raleigh. It's the first African-American planned subdivision in the city. Construction began in 1956. And I just recently found out that it's on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic district, which was established back in 2011. So PEJ was formed when residents began complaining of issues such as persistent flooding, trash dumping, and just a perceived overall neglect they felt from the city of Raleigh as they reached out to them to try to get help with these with their issues. A shorter term vision of PEJ was to address the environmental injustices that I'm going to speak about soon. And a longer term vision was to create an urban wetlands destination park, which is today known as the Walnut Creek Wetland Park in Southeast Raleigh, just north of the Rochester Heights community. I've been a board member of PEJ since 2017, but I was indirectly have been involved with PEJ since the late 1990s as a young graduate student at NC State University. I actually did some research in the Walnut Creek watershed and was made aware of some of the issues going on at that time. However, I was a very green graduate student, not meaning that I knew anything about green infrastructure, but actually I was very ignorant of a lot of things, and including green infrastructure and environmental justice. But over the years, I've learned some things, and I hope to kind of share those with you in the next couple of minutes. So this map is a watershed of the watershed of Walnut Creek. You will see Rochester Heights highlighted in the red square. That's the subdivision of Rochester Heights. And a watershed is essentially the land area that drains to a certain location on the landscape. So this map is showing where the dotted line goes across. That's essentially about half the watershed of Walnut Creek that drains into the Rochester Heights community. So out of its 46 square mile land area or drainage area, exactly half of it, or 23 square miles, drains into the into the Rochester Heights community. This is probably one of the most important slides in this whole presentation because it does a great job of helping to understand or put environmental justice issues, particularly associated with flooding, in their proper context. So this is a map showing US Census data, which is basically as you go from upstream in Cary, where Walnut Creek starts. It actually starts near Cary Town Center, if you all know where that is. You can see by the color coding of this map, if you go from the light color is 0 to 21% African-American population, all the way up to 52 to 98% for the darker colors. This clearly shows that as you go from upstream in Walnut Creek to downstream, the percent African-American population rises, and particularly in the Rochester Heights neighborhood, back in 2010, the percent African-American population in Rochester Heights was 98.5. For those of you familiar with the area, I'm sure you're aware that the demographics are changing rapidly, and I'm just going to show some proof of that. This is a New York Times article on the left and a News and Observer article on the right from 2019. And I'm sure as y'all are aware, with the explosive growth and redevelopment that has happened in Raleigh, and particularly Southeast Raleigh, which has been historically underserved, has become an attractive location for folks that are moving into this area, as well as younger folks who are moving in downtown areas throughout the country. I've been told by folks that are familiar with the housing market in this area that landlords and real estate agents have actually been targeting their outreach to this new demographic of non-minority folks. And the South Park, which the article on the New York Times article on the left talks about, is located literally up the street from Rochester Heights to the northwest. And you can just see by driving up and down there how this area has changed. Property taxes have also gone up significantly during the last county or city reevaluation. And a lot of long-term residents are currently being displaced, and as well as a cultural identity that has made this area what it is also changing rapidly. And these news paper articles kind of highlight what's going on and how the demographics here are changing. So lastly, this is the landscape context of Walnut Creek, and you can kind of see as you go from green up, it's higher in elevation where it starts to the left, and as you go down into Southeast Raleigh, where Rochester Heights is, you can see it's lower in elevation. So, two simple things. Number one, water flows downhill. And number two, water tends to collect in lower elevations. And this is kind of what this map is showing. The elevation where Walnut Creek starts in Cary is about 476 feet above sea level. When you get down to Rochester Heights, it's about 224 feet above sea level. So it's over 250-foot elevation change from where it starts to where it goes down. This is also a very important map to kind of understand the context of Walnut Creek and flooding as it relates to the Rochester Heights. This map right here shows, if you can see my cursor, that there's an extensive, there's a significant portion of the Rochester Heights community that is currently in what's called the FEMA floodplain. The Federal Emergency Management Agency oversees floodplain management and regulations and insurance. And you can see kind of where Rochester Heights is situated, that more than likely it probably wasn't a good place to situate a community so close to Walnut Creek. All right, this is a letter on the left that was written Well, before I jump into that, this kind of sets the context to look at what appear to be some blatant environmental injustices that the Rochester Heights residents have faced over the decades, and also those things that ultimately led to the creation of Partners for Environmental Justice. So this letter to the left is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal agency that oversees the implementation of the Clean Water Act to protect our nation's waters, such as streams, wetlands, and navigation channels, as well as they do flood studies in different communities. I want to draw your attention to the last paragraph that in this letter that was written to the former city manager for the city of Raleigh, Dempsey Benton. The last paragraph says, measures to lessen the Walnut Creek flood problems were investigated in detail in the early 1970s. Those findings indicated there were no identifiable economically feasible measures to provide flood damage reduction in the area. We do not find any significant change in the flood damage or development for this area that would significantly alter our prior findings. So essentially what they're saying is they studied it in the 70s. This letter is written in 1986, and they have not noticed any significant development or anything else that would change their findings, that essentially there's really no way to address the flooding in the Rochester Heights community. The news clip on the right it talks about how residents in Rochester Heights, the city council voted to have the residents to charge them over $1,000 over a 10-year period to come up with or to pay for or cost share the cost of doing flood and drainage improvements in their neighborhood. So we're going to look at the next, why that's relevant is that there were areas during the same time, there were areas in other parts of Raleigh, particularly North Raleigh, that had flood problems, and residents were not charged to address their drainage issues. So these next two maps, this is the this is a bird's eye view of the watershed draining to Rochester Heights from 1974. And if you notice, I'm going to switch to a 1988 aerial photograph, and just notice if you see a difference in areas like these darker areas, which generally represent undeveloped areas. You can see large undeveloped areas all along here. So now I'm going to flip to the 1988 aerial and just notice the difference between 1974 and 1988. One more time. So I'm sure you can see there was a huge amount of development that occurred between 1974 and 1988. This is a close-up of the Rochester Heights neighborhood on the top in red and the Biltmore Hills community on the bottom, both of which are historically African-American subdivisions. So again, 1974, 1988. Take note of the fact that Interstate 40 now appears in 1988. So sometime between the 70s and the late 80s, Interstate 40 was built right in, that separated essentially Rochester Heights and the Biltmore Hills community. So I'll just ask the question, based on this information, do you think that the Corps of Engineers findings that there was no significant development in this area between the 1970s and mid to late 1980s was true? That's just something to think about as I move forward. And so the three primary issues that PEJ was created to address were flooding, basically to do things that are going to help reduce flooding, to do things that are going to help reduce the amount of trash that is being dumped in the area, and also just overall the deteriorating situation of the ecosystem surrounding Rochester Heights and the Walnut Creek wetlands. So PEJ basically created this mission document called the Walnut Creek 2000. You can see the mission statement in the middle. And as part of that, they commissioned Dr. Robin Moore with NC State School of Design, who is still currently teaching there, to come up with a conceptual plan for an urban wetland education park. And again, this was the beginning of what is now the Walnut Creek Wetland Park on Peterson Street. So basically, this is a picture of the visionary leaders of PEJ at the time. Dr. Norman Camp on the upper left, Dr. Ed Milligan, Ross Andrews, who was a board member and was actually the first director of the Walnut Creek Wetland Park before, unfortunately, he passed away back in 2013. But basically, Dr. Camp and Ross would speak to whoever they could about, talk to school groups, city council members, community organizations, letting them know about the environmental injustices that were going on and sharing PEJ's vision on how to address those issues. Ross led stream cleanups in the area, and that's actually how I got more directly involved with the work PEJ was doing back in 2001. And basically, folks would meet in the fellowship hall of St. Ambrose Church, be given information about what was going on, and then they go out and do cleanups. And these cleanups are now actually a part of Wake County Big Sweep, but they were started by Partners for Environmental Justice and their partners. You can see, how much trash and debris was removed from, the 90s and from 2006 to 2017. Last thing I'll say about this portion of the presentation is that this is a list of PEJ's early partners, and this is the single most important component of PEJ's success in addressing these environmental injustices over the years. Is the number one, the visionary leadership of Dr. Camp, Ed Milligan, Ross Andrews, and others. But secondly, the great multidisciplinary partners that PEJ had, from faith-based organizations, government, nonprofit, private sector, schools, that really helped join with PEJ's mission to address the environmental injustices going on in this area. So all of that culminated in, this is a groundbreaking ceremony of the Wetland Center. And I want to highlight, that's Dr. Norman Camp, who is a longtime chairperson of PEJ, Dr. Robin Moore, who PEJ commissioned to create the conceptual master plan for the Walnut Creek Wetland Park, former City Councilman Eugene Weeks, former City of Raleigh Mayor Charles Meeker, and former City Council and current Wake County Commissioner James West. This was the dedication ceremony in September 2009. And it really was an all hands on deck effort. And but this was the culmination of years, over a decade of advocacy in this community. So now I want to kind of switch gears and talk about kind of more kind of current issues going on within the Walnut Creek and within the Walnut Creek watershed. So this map, I know it's very busy. What you need to take note of is the yellow areas are flood-prone areas along Walnut Creek that are currently flood-prone areas. Dana Drive in the upstream, close to Crossroads Plaza, Rochester Heights, Rose Lane, and Dayshin Road. We have, in terms of determining whether flooding is still an issue in these areas, we've canvassed all these areas, we've spoken to residents, and we've been told, and we even have some video and photo footage of current flooding that's still going on in these areas. To the left is a stream draining the Walnut Creek is in the woods back here. This is an apartment complex near Dana Drive that actually was flooded. Residents were displaced from this apartment complex for 1.5 years back in 2017 after some significant floods along this creek and Walnut Creek back here. The photo on the right is a gentleman who is showing the level of flooding. His house is actually located, he lives in the Rochester Heights community. His house is located probably is the closest home to Walnut Creek and is in the floodplain right now. Both of these photos were taken during a February 2017 rain event. This is a News and Observer article that talks about essentially what this article is saying from April 2017, is that of all the flood prone areas in Raleigh, we know about Crabtree Creek and other areas, Walnut Creek essentially is the most flood prone watershed in the entire Walnut Creek drainage basin. Also, a lot of these communities, most of the flood prone communities I showed you in the map that were in yellow are also communities of color. This article is showing the flooding in the Dacian Road, which is downstream of Rochester Heights. All right, so PEJ's current advocacy can kind of fall in these categories of equitable development, low impact development, green infrastructure, and community empowerment. These are things that we're trying to focus our energies on now based on, the current situations going on in the watershed. So one of the take home messages in terms of, how can you or how can the League of Women Voters help these are some graphics about equitable development. And you can see the definition at the top of the page. It's a definition from EPA that defines what equitable development is. And essentially, it's an answer to environmental injustices in terms of how development happens. And it's not just environmentally related, it's socially related, it's economic, it's social, it's public health related. The figure on the left is a cartoon of opportunity zones. Opportunity zones were created by Congress to encourage long-term investments in low-income urban and rural communities around the United States. In talking or seeing correspondence from some African-American urban planners throughout the United States, this is not necessarily a good idea. It sounds good, but it's not. And just being aware of that, this cartoon kind of illustrates some issues or what happened, how this has been actually implemented in certain communities throughout the United States. The graphic on the right is created by Southeast Raleigh Promise, which is a nonprofit organization based in Southeast Raleigh. And they have I guess a principle called revitalization without displacement. So this basically, Southeast Raleigh Promise is a nonprofit organization that was instrumental in the development of the Beacon site, which is near I-40 and Rock Quarry Road, where they have the Southeast Raleigh YMCA, Southeast Raleigh Elementary School, and the Beacon Ridge Apartments, which is an affordable housing community. And this whole campus was built with this revitalization without displacement principle that looks at holistically trying to improve conditions in underserved areas. And one of their tenets is cradle to grave education, and there's some other components in that. Another way of helping to promote equitable development is what's called an Equitable Development Scorecard. This was developed in the Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota area for developers to complete as part of their community engagement process. So something tangible that the League of Women Voters may be able to consider doing is to lobby municipal planning departments within Wake County, such as the city of Raleigh, their planning department and planning commissions to incorporate environmental equitable development metrics, such as those found in this document, when into decision-making with regards to development, large development and rezoning projects. In case I forget to mention, late before I finish up, Partners for Environmental Justice was heavily involved in the rezoning process of the Downtown South project, which is the largest proposed development in the history of the city of Raleigh. So this issue kind of came up during that rezoning process, and it's just something for the league to be aware of if you aren't already aware of it. Another way is to help promote low impact development and green infrastructure. So the graphic on the left is produced by the city of Raleigh. There's actually a link to where this document is at the end of my presentation, but this just shows how green infrastructure can be integrated into community development and community parks. I'm going to talk about green infrastructure in a minute or so. The graphic to the right shows how green infrastructure can be incorporated into parks. The photo on the bottom left is an affordable housing community in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I got to see as part of a conference called the One Water Summit back in 2019. And this neighborhood, they intentionally incorporated green infrastructure into it. And lastly, the image on the right is the low impact development guidebook for North Carolina that I also will briefly touch on. All right, and this is what green infrastructure looks like. This is the Walnut Creek Wetland Education Center, and permeable pavement that allows stormwater to soak into the ground. And then this bioretention area allows stormwater that reaches this area to be naturally treated in a similar fashion to how we may use Brita filters to filter tap water. The Brita filter is based on what nature does in terms of, instead of the water running off, it's able to soak into the ground and be naturally treated or decontaminated by soil, plant roots, and other things in the soil. So why should you care? Let me just go through this really quickly. So the graphic on the left, it talks about the environmental benefits to communities such as water quality, talks about the economic benefits that green infrastructure can provide communities in the form of green jobs, workforce development. And then it also talks about the social and public health benefits that green infrastructure can provide, such as air quality and lowering urban heat island effects that happen in large cities with lots of pavement and concrete. The graphic on the right shows how the built environment and the natural environment are very important determinants in the overall health and well-being of our neighborhoods and communities. So I know I'm reaching my 30-minute limit, so I'm about to wrap up. So these are some recommendations just based on our experience with PEJ and lessons learned. Number one, I'll let y'all look at this, but some of the lessons we learned as part of our advocacy in the Downtown South rezoning process is contacting planning department staff to learn about the rezoning process and timelines. That was very helpful for us. Having a diverse set of partners with community connections and that had specific expertise in areas such as stormwater management was also something that was very valuable and useful. And when you're, community engagement and things of that nature, trying to get the right people at the table is incredibly important. And then directly in engagement with stakeholders outside of public meetings. So we reached out to citizens, we reached out to city council, planning commission folks, and frankly, you can have more candid conversations outside of public meetings, and hope with the goal of coming to hopefully coming to mutually agreeable solutions. And if anybody has any questions about the Downtown South project and some of the mutually beneficial solutions, feel free to ask in the Q&A. My second to last slide, these are just some resources about equitable development, green infrastructure, and low impact development that you can feel free to look at your leisure. And these are some local organizations that are involved with environmental justice in the area. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I do want to remind you that there will be a PDF document of this presentation made available, so you can look at this, view and look at this information in your own time. And I will now turn this back over to either the league or Veronica to continue. Thanks again for your time.
I have the honor of introducing Veronica Carter. Veronica Carter is a Leland Town Council member who holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Fordham University and a Master of Public Administration from Troy University, and is a graduate of the United States Army's Command and General Staff College. She served as the Director of Administration and Logistics for the Military Ocean Terminal at Sunny Point, and as an international civil servant at the United Nations headquarters in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations as a logistics officer. She was appointed to the Coastal Resource Commission and served in that role from 2008 to 2012. She has over 40 years of experience in managing complex logistic operations. Veronica has devoted much of her time to ensuring environmental justice by empowering, advocating for, and educating environmental justice communities in southeastern North Carolina. She currently serves on the North Carolina Coastal Federation Board of Directors, the Duke Superfund Advisory Board, and the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Board. In November, she was elected to the Town Council of Leland, North Carolina. With regard for her accomplishments, I am pleased to welcome Veronica to this session of Timely Topics.
Thank you, Catherine. And that was 2019 I was elected. So I've actually served now for almost 2 years. So first things first, let's see if I can get my slideshow up. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Amin, thank you for that handoff. I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Amin said because I think it's important. Amin has given you a very focused view of environmental injustice and environmental justice in your neighborhood because you're the League for Raleigh. As Catherine said, I am in southeastern North Carolina in Brunswick County. And so my focus started in Brunswick County, but I want to give you more of a view statewide, because as I sit on the DEQ Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Board, we hear and see problems statewide. And frankly, North Carolina is somewhat the birthplace for the environmental justice movement. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, why do I do the things I do? People ask me that all the time. And I tell them it's because of my faith. And so I thought that this is one of my favorite quotes from the Bible. And it's when the prophet Micah says, what does God want from you, humans? And he says, he's shown you what's good. He wants you to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And I feel like if I can do that in most of what I do, I don't do it well, don't get me wrong, but if I can try to keep that in mind, then my faith requires me to speak out when I see injustice. So what is this thing that we call environmental justice? And Amin did a good job of telling you the EPA's definition. It's the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. Don't forget the or income, because that's important. We have environmental justice communities that are predominantly white. People lose sight of that. It's not just about race or color, but it's with regard and respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So what does that mean? It means that you shouldn't be dumped upon just because you're poor, because you're of a certain nationality, because you're of a certain color or race. You should not be dumped upon if you do not have what some people call the communities of least resistance. You don't necessarily think you have a voice to fight back. What does meaningful involvement mean? Well, it means that you have an opportunity to participate in decisions. It means you have that voice. It means that when decision makers, I guess I'm one of them now as an elected official, but when decision makers are making decisions about something that may impact your environment, your health, your property, that we include the public in it. And that we don't always have these meetings at 10 o'clock in the middle of a workday. The league here in Brunswick County knows I'm one of their voices that shows up at important meetings with our Board of Elections, because they tend to have their meetings in the middle of the day, in the middle of a workday. And it's usually about early voting, something I'm sure is near and dear to all of your hearts out there. And I'm like, well, great, the people who would most likely benefit from this can't get here because they're at work. So I'm going to come here and talk for them. But so when we talk about meaningful involvement with environmental justice or injustice, we're saying that the public's contribution can influence that regulatory agent's decision. Have I seen it happen? Absolutely. You know, that you're going to be considered in the decision-making process. And of course, that we're not just going to like wait for you to come to us. Decision makers are actually going to go out there and help facilitate the involvement for those people. So how did this all get started? Well, believe it or not, environmental justice movement began right here in North Carolina in Warren County. And it had to do with a company dumping 31,000 gallons of PCB. Now all of us have heard of that, on the sides of the road, believe it or not, in 14 North Carolina counties. And that was perfectly legal at the time. So when the neighborhoods found out about it, no, by the way, I should mention the neighborhoods they were going to dump this at were not your affluent neighborhoods. They were communities of color, poor communities of color. And so the folks went and tried to get this stopped. And they literally laid in the road to stop the dump trucks from coming. Because the state, not necessarily the polluters, the state said, it's okay. We'll just build a big landfill and put all the contaminated soil from their dumping in the landfill. Guess where the landfill was? Next to a community of color. So after 3 lawsuits and lots of public hearings and a lot of scientists coming in, the Warren County commissioners finally came to their senses and compromised with the state. And Governor Hunt back then said that they would not expand that landfill and that Warren County wouldn't become a waste county. However, that didn't do it. That didn't end it. And yes, that sign is still standing there. In 1983, they discovered that water from a landfill, from underneath a landfill, was becoming a contamination problem in Warren County. Because you see, even if a landfill has a liner, all liners leak eventually. And so once again, they were stuck with dealing with PCBs and contamination. And again, it's in that same targeted neighborhood. So how did Veronica get involved in environmental justice, a kid from New York? Well, my late dad and I moved here in late 2003 to the town of Leland, which at the time had about 2,500 people in it. We now have 25,000, just for the record. And my dad bought his first house ever. I am the first generation college graduate. My mom and dad were very quite proud of that, rest their souls. And this was my dad's first and his only house ever. And he was very, very proud of it. He had every right to be. And shortly after he moved here, without my mom, who had passed away a year earlier, he discovered, as he went to shopping at the Piggly Wiggly, because somebody gave him a little handmade handout, that they were about to put a landfill about 5 miles away from his new house. And he gave me the handout and said, you know what? There's some people talking. This doesn't sound good. I'm going to go to this meeting and see what's going on. So he went to the meeting without me. I let him go. And suddenly at that point, 75-year-old dad became an environmentalist for the first time in his life. And how did Veronica get here? Because Veronica's a good daughter. And at one point, my dad said, you need to come to this meeting. They really could use you. And, they need some help organizing. Don't tell any of them I said that. One of them's on the call, I know. But he said, you may need some help here. They can use that military stuff that you do. So I joined. And the first thing we learned in the military is to be a good follower as opposed to a leader, because I had a lot to learn about the place and the county and the town and the area. And one of the things I learned was that they were going to put this landfill in the neighboring town, which is Navassa. Navassa is a predominantly African-American town. Now, depending on where you live in North Carolina, you say, it's not a big deal. Well, Brunswick County is a predominantly white county. I'm going to give you some demographic numbers here in a minute. But this is even more special because while people normally associate the Gullah Geechee people with South Carolina and Georgia, North Carolina actually is part of the Gullah Geechee Trail. We actually have descendants of the Gullah Geechee slaves, and a great many of their descendants live in the town of Navassa. There are actual graveyards that still have those African-American ancestors from the 1800s. And as an African-American woman, I'm gonna tell you, that's something that you don't usually see in our background. A lot of times we get stuck if we're tracing back our ancestors to right after emancipation. We can't go any further back. Many of these people can go that far back. There's a church there, Reeves Chapel, that they're trying to rehabilitate, which is a whole nother story. But that was actually built by slaves, former slaves, and they moved the chapel from the present location on the plantation to its present location using logs after emancipation. So the Gullah Geechee people have that distinct culture, language, lifestyle, and they have been in that area, in the area of Navassa, since the 1700s. So originally, excuse me, Navassa was a rice plantation, and they did pretty well until they learned that they could grow rice better and faster and a better quality of rice further south. And then it became an industrial town. And it actually got its name because the Navassa Guano Company, which is what you see there. Guano, if you don't know, is bird poop. And apparently there's an island in the Caribbean by the name of Navassa, which has a lot of mountains. It's not inhabited, but it has lots of birds, and they poop a lot. And when they poop, their poop becomes guano, and guano, they discovered, was a really important ingredient in the making of fertilizer. So even though we weren't building or planting rice here in southeastern North Carolina, we were planting a whole lot of other stuff, not only here, but also further west. And you had the Port of Wilmington, so they could bring the guano in. And also you had the rest of the Cape Fear River, so they could take all of the exports out into the Caribbean and to Europe. So Navassa actually became a really popular location. It's high on a bluff, it doesn't flood a lot. It has rail service and stop, and it has river access to the river, and it's at a very high point in the river, so they could bring larger ships there. So it became an industrial town. They made fertilizer, and they made something else called creosote. If you aren't familiar with creosote is that material that if you remember the old telephone poles and maybe railroad ties, they had that coating on them so that they wouldn't, they stand up longer, they wouldn't be destroyed by the weather. Well, that's creosote. And so they had fertilizer plants and creosotes, and those were the two main industries in Navassa's history. There were a number of fertilizer plants. There was one big creosote plant. It's called, now it's called Kerr-McGee. It no longer exists, but keep that name in mind because it's going to come back to you. But what happens is that when you make fertilizer, you get sulfuric acid. And when you make creosote, and you have to dump these big pieces of wood, telephone poles, etc., or even railroad ties into the creosote, you build a pit, you put the creosote in it, and you let it soak for a while till it soaks into the wood, and then you take them out and let them dry. Well, the creosote is incredibly heavy. It's kind of tarish, and it sinks down into the ground. And they have not made creosote there in about 30 plus years. And they've dug holes and discovered creosote 80 to 100 feet down still. So we're going to get to that. So what we have is a toxic mess. As I mentioned earlier, Kerr-McGee is a home to an operation that had 3 different owners. until 1974. This kind of explains a little bit more what I was talking about with what creosote was used for and how they mixed it up in a sludge and they buried all. Well, this coal tar based stuff sunk down into the water. Amin mentioned something. I was kind of chuckling to myself when he said that one part of Raleigh was 200 plus feet above sea level and another part was 400 plus feet above sea level. Well, we're about 19 to 20 feet above sea level. So if I told you that something sunk down 80 feet, that means it has not just sunk past all of the ground and the dirt and all that. It has literally filed the groundwaters. It's filed the aquifer. It's filed everything there. And, you know, back then, even frankly, up until when I got here in the early 2000s, there were a lot of people still on well water. Think about that. There were people on well water and you had creosote that has sunk down 80 to 100 feet. That particular site where Kerr-McGee is a superfund, and it is in the process of being cleaned up because of a lawsuit. But frankly, that cleanup has taken 6 years because we're not quite sure how to clean all of that up. Some of it may never get cleaned up because it's right on the edge of the Cape Fear River and primary nursery areas. So the creosote went straight down through the soil, through the marshland and down to the aquifers and even further, you know, to basically the riverbeds and everything else. This is a picture that the multi-state trust that's responsible for helping to clean this up actually showed the folks. That orangey brown area here, that's where most of the contamination is. And that's where it went down. They have wells. They have little sites that they've dug, a number of them, hundreds of them actually, where they go and test and see how far down it is. And that's where they have found the darker the color, the deeper the contamination. Again, some of that may never be cleaned up. Now, this little line right here is Sturgeon Creek. By the way, this little line, piece of land over here is the town of Leland, okay? This is Navassa, this is Leland. We literally are neighbors. But over here, out of screen, is the Cape Fear River. So Sturgeon Creek leads into the Cape Fear River. That's a concern. So let's talk about Navassa. Why is this an environmental justice community? The last really good census numbers we had were from 2019. Navassa at that point was home to about 2,300 people. A little over 73% were African-American. Okay. 18% were white. That number is actually down. When I moved here again in late 2003, early 2004, Navassa was 94% African-American. So there's some gentrification taking place right now. And that's a little scary because remember I talked about that rich Gullah Geechee heritage. A number of organizations are working very, very hard to try to capture that heritage before we lose it. And that's one of the things that is proposed for what we do with this property. So you see the lines of Navassa, you see where Leland is. You also see the Cape Fear River, okay? So you have the Cape Fear River, the Northeast Cape Fear River, they meet at Eagle Island and then go down and form Cape Fear River, which empties out at the, really at Southport into the Atlantic Ocean. But look at this, Brunswick County, where we're located, is 86.5% white. So you have a town that's mostly Black in a mostly white county. Well, what's that got to do with it? Here you go. Of the federally recognized Superfund and brownfield sites in Brunswick County, and these are federally recognized. The federal government has a different standard than the state. This all gets complicated. 2 out of 3 in Brunswick County are in Navassa. There, of the 17 inactive hazardous waste sites in Brunswick County, and by the way, we're one of the larger geographical counties in the state, of the 100 counties, 7 are in Navassa. And of the 3 state recognized brownfields in Brunswick County, 2 are in Navassa. Why are they in Navassa? Well, because racism exists. because NIMBY exists, not in my backyard. And so if I'm going to dump on someone, I'm going to dump on people I think don't have a voice and a say. You can see how much of the Kerr-McGee site takes up the town of Navassa. This is the Cape Fear River, riverfront property. Brunswick County is one of the fastest growing counties in the state of North Carolina. Leland is one of the fastest growing towns in the state of North Carolina. Navassa is not. And one of the reasons is because they've got all these brownfields, and a brownfield, just for your, in case you don't know, is where there has been an industrial site, there has been contamination. It doesn't rise to the level of being a superfund site, but it's contaminated and would probably need to be, would cause a hazard to health. It needs to be cleaned up before anything can be developed there. So here is prime riverfront property in the fastest growing county in North Carolina, and there's nothing there right now because it has to be cleaned up. Okay. By the way, this was Kerr-McGee. This was the creosote factory. Over here was one of the fertilizer plants. Over here was, Smith Douglas was another fertilizer plant. So that's the town of Navassa. We're working with them. We're trying to get them cleaned up. We're trying to get them growing. There's some other things that are going on in Navassa I'll talk to you about a little bit. But let's talk about Southeastern North Carolina. I like to tell people, and I've told now Administrator Michael Regan this when he was Secretary of DEQ, if there's a pollution or polluter out there and it has to do with EJ, we probably have it in Southeastern North Carolina. Concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs. Now, don't get me wrong. I like a good piece of bacon just like the next person. That was until I got to North Carolina and realized the cost of that bacon and the cost to human beings. There are 2.35 million hogs in Duplin County. There are more hogs than there are people in Duplin County. There's only about 10 million people in the state, but there are 2.35 million hogs. And that is the concentration of those CAFOs. Now, CAFOs aren't just hogs. They're also chickens and anything where you pack a bunch of animals into pens, for lack of a better word, and they make poop. So what do you do with all the poop? Well, you dispose of it. One of the ways that they dispose of it is that they use it as fertilizer. So they shoot all of they put the fertilizer in kind of lagoons, when they poop, it comes in there, it becomes a marshy kind of mess. And then they use big hoses. If you've ever driven through some of the farming areas, you see them when they're watering their fields. Sometimes that's fertilizer. You say, well, that's okay, Veronica. No, that's okay if you're the farmer. If you're the person who lives across the road and you can't leave your house because when the wind blows, all of that poop is coating your house, your car, your windows. You can't open your windows. You can't sell your land because who's going to come and buy a property that's filled with hog poop and smells like hog poop? And oh, by the way, it causes really bad breathing diseases, asthma, COPD. We've had people die of lung cancers. We have trouble with causation because these are poor counties, and a lot of times folks don't have access to doctors. The records are not where they need to be, but no one deserves to live this way. Again, justice. And why should we speak out when we witness immoral or unjust acts? Because that's who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be our brothers and sisters' neighbor. We're supposed to be there to be their voice because two voices are stronger than one voice. In Southeastern North Carolina, look at the statistics. There are waste pits that make up over 6,800 acres of our countryside. 37 are within a half mile of a school, 288 within a half mile of a church. Here's a real hard one. 136 are within a half mile of a public well. And 170 are within the state's 100-year floodplain, which we discovered during Florence didn't mean a whole heck of a lot because places flooded that have never flooded before, including Sutton Lake, which is a coal ash pond. It's a lake. If you've ever been to Wilmington or New Hanover County and you've seen Sutton Lake, and it's a place where people recreationally fish. Nothing wrong with that, except if you remember where that water came from. The water came from as a cooling pond for the coal ash factory from Duke that was right next door. And they put fish in there and said, go at it, go fish. And we would see people fishing there, and we'd be arguing about the coal ash that's in the ponds right next to it. And they say, well, no problem, because we have liners. Well, remember I told you all liners leak. Well, the liners were leaking into Sutton Lake, and there were absolutely no warning signs to any of the fishermen that were bringing those fish home to their families, until we did a fish consumption study and showed that that was a problem. Now there at least are warning signs. We actually had to bring the environmental justice director from EPA Region 4 down to the lake while she and her staff were standing there looking at this very pretty lake and realizing, based on some of the studies we've done and presented to them, that fish coming out of there were impacted with different dangerous chemicals. A guy walked up to us and said, hey, you guys going fishing? Here's what you can catch. You know, gave us a cute little fish and wildlife guide of all the different fish that were in there. And they were appalled because here they could find out what fish they could catch, but there was absolutely no sign warning them about, hey, if you catch those fish, here's what might be in them. So that's why you should care. There are people in our state, in our area, our neighbors, who need those fish for subsistence. They need those fish to round out their diets and their family's budget for the week. They don't have a choice. They're fishing out of Cape Fear River. They're fishing out of Sutton Lake. They're fishing out of Sturgeon Creek, which is right next to and goes under that creosote that we talked about. So what's your role as the League of Women Voters, or as just neighbors and residents of North Carolina? Your voice. I said get involved. These are some different organizations, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, which Amin mentioned, his group, which is right in your backyard. You know, the NCAA, excuse me, they'll kill me. I'm a member, life member. in NAACP has environmental justice and climate justice is one of their focuses. So if you join your local NAACP branch, you can join their committee on environmental and climate justice. We didn't really talk about climate justice, but as we get more and more into global warming, we're discovering that these neighborhoods that African Americans and poor people, indigenous people were all pushed into because nobody else wanted them or thought, yeah, I don't want to live over there. Well, those neighborhoods were never the best neighborhoods. They didn't get the really cool neighborhoods. They got the ones that are on downstream, as we discovered from Amin's briefing. And now, because of increased development, are prone to flooding. That's climate justice. Here in southeastern North Carolina, a lot of those neighborhoods were the marshlands because nobody wanted to plant there. Mosquitoes, there bugs, there water moccasins. Who wants to plant alligators? Who wants to plant there? Who wants to live there? Who wants to build a house there? It's going to be a pain. Well, now with sea level rise, some of those places are not going to be able to exist 30 years from now. You know, our biggest investment is our homes. And you won't even be able to leave your home because it'll be underwater in 30 years. Well, it's getting people's attention because, you know, if it's a beach home and it's worth $5 million, hey, let's do something about this sea level rise. However, if it's just someone's house that nobody else wanted that land and has been in your family for 100 years, one, you're probably about to get taxed out of it because people want that waterfront property. And now, after a storm, you may not be able to afford to go back there. So I leave you with the words of the prophet Amos, that we need to let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. It's up to us to ensure that there's justice for everyone. Every time I get before the town council, we stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance. And I've told people this before, I'm always very, very struck by the last part of that pledge. It says, and justice for all. It's up to us to ensure justice for all. That's a picture of a church group that decided to go up their 1 mile, half mile up the road on the left and a half mile up the road on the right, and just pick up trash for Earth Day, get everybody involved. You can do that, by the way, by getting in touch with your local NCDOT. They will give you cute little vests. Notice the little safety vests. They will not give you the cute little reachers. Believe it or not, we got that from the county detention center. You know, so it helps to know people. But they'll give you the bags, and you fix the bags, you put them down by the side of the road, and they'll come pick them up. Notice the 9mm that's on the ground there. A couple of Boy Scouts found that just kind of on the side of the road. The nice little deputy sheriff down there was with them as they collected it. We found snakes. We found medical waste. I don't know why you would throw an IV bag out the window of your car on the side of the road, but we found a whole bunch of stuff. Fortunately, it's not there, but those are things you can do. Those are things that we all need to do. We all need to think about doing. And I could talk probably for another hour and a half on things that are wrong in southeastern North Carolina. We have a neighborhood, Flemington, which is an environmental justice neighborhood. It is next to Lake Sutton. And initially, when they discovered that the liners were leaking at Sutton Lake, the way that they found out was they were testing the well water for this EJ community, and the wells were all polluted by Sutton Lake. So Duke, through a court order, had to go in and actually build a pipeline to pump fresh water into all of that neighborhood's wells, but it took fighting. They don't know where to turn. They don't know how to turn. And they turn sometimes to environmental groups, Cape Fear River Watch. If you have a water keeper or river keeper in your area, every river has a river keeper in North Carolina. Join their group, join their local group, because they're going to care about the quality of that river. That's their job, and they could use help with volunteers. If you live along the coast, 300 miles of North Carolina coast that we have, North Carolina Coastal Federation that I'm a proud member of. Amin mentioned your former mayor, Charles Meeker, who also is a board member. We care about what goes on, not just about the coast, but a little bit inland to those streams and lakes, or excuse me, streams and rivers that dump into, forgive my Brooklyn scientific, I'm the poli-sci major, not Amin, but they dump into the ocean. We care about that because they also dump pollutants into the ocean. So I am done. That's what I have to talk to you about. I think we've got a really good explanation now of environmental justice and a little bit of an explanation about climate justice. And I welcome any questions on that you might have for me.
Well, as a co-chair for Timely Topics, I would like to thank Amin and Veronica for sharing this information with us. It has been very informative, and I feel like I know a lot more about the environment and the injustices in the environment. It has been a very enlightening session, and we thank you for sharing your expertise with us. It is greatly appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you both. Amin, if I could ask you to start your video and unmute yourself. We'll begin with some of the questions that have been accumulating here. And I'd like to start with this one about the superfunds. Do superfunds have mandatory time limits for mitigation efforts? Are they enforced?
They get on a list, and I mean, you may, because of your role, you may know a little bit more about this, but there's a list of superfunds. And so no, there's not a time limit because they can't afford to clean all of them all at once, unfortunately. So as they move up on the list, they get funding. Sometimes they get funding like the Kerr-McGee site because of a lawsuit and a settlement. And that is how they are, we can afford to clean them. In this case, with the Kerr-McGee site in Nevada, it was based on, again, a lawsuit. That was one. They confiscated a number of billions of dollars, divided it up. This company that owned Kerr-McGee had a number of sites around the country. They were all EJ sites, by the way. And so they divided the money up based on the size of the sites, and they thought the pollution at the time, and decided that this money would be used for remediation. There's some fish and wildlife money associated with this as well to help remediate the water and the wetlands around it. And so we've been working on it. Now, I mentioned DEQ and EPA. They're both benefactors. The town is involved. This is a meaningful involvement with the town and with a nonprofit group that is made up of people and residents of the town. And they have the NAACP, they have the local environmental groups, including the Coastal Federation and Cape Fear River Watch. We're all there for them to act as their honest brokers or technical experts if they need them. We've got UNCW folks, University of North Carolina in Wilmington, folks that are involved. We've had folks from the Duke University Superfund Advisory. So there's a number of people involved. So to answer your question, if there's a time limit, we probably have busted it, but there's meaningful involvement. So none of us are arguing about it. I mean, do you know any more about?
I sure don't. Yeah, I generally don't deal with brownfields. My experience is more with water, specifically water resources. But I think you covered it. You covered it well.
Let me come back to the local region. One of the questions that came in, and I mean, I saw that you have seen this question. It's the Kane Realty plans to use Opportunity Zone funding. How will this affect Rochester Heights?
Yeah, I responded in the question and answer to that question, and I essentially don't know. I would say there's an organization called Wake that was formed within the last year, and they were tracking those type of issues and affordable housing and workforce development. And I put a contact name in the question and answer. He was kind of our primary contact. They were one of the partner groups that we were kind of collaborating with throughout the lengthy rezoning process for the Downtown South project. But I don't have any information. The gentleman's name, our contact was Devin Ross, but I haven't had communications with him in several months.
I see that listed here, and Devin Ross as Justice United. Is that the correct organization?
Yeah, but he was one of the leaders of One Wake, although he's with he works with another organization as well. One Wake is essentially a collection of faith-based organizations and other organizations within Wake County that try to address social justice issues.
And the other question that concerns the Downtown South project is specifically what has Kane Realty agreed to mitigate flooding as they build that project?
Yeah, so we and our partners were able to negotiate with Kane that they are putting in, there's kind of two levels to what they're going to be doing. Number one, they have to abide by above and beyond stormwater management with all phases of their development, which would involve things like doing flood analyses based on their development they're proposing to determine if there's going to be any potential flooding or rises in what's called base flood elevations downstream of their development. The second thing is that Kane Realty has established what's called the Walnut Creek Corridor Fund, which is in place to basically be kind of like an escrow account for flood improvements projects that can be done not just at their location, but upstream or downstream. So they're going to be putting in money in a year or two. There's a certain stage where as they continue to develop that site, they're going to be putting funds into this account. And there's a stakeholder group that is being formed that includes PEJ and our partners that are going to kind of decide, we're going to decide kind of where those funds get spent. And we're also going to meet with I'm forgetting the other component of the stakeholder agreement. It's just lost. I can't remember it, but the stakeholder group is going to kind of help decide where the funds are spent and apply for grant applications as well and basically the CANE funds will go towards any grant funds that or grant applications that we apply for, kind of leverage funding to do projects within the entire Walnut Creek watershed that are going to kind of help improve conditions in these flood-prone areas. So those agreements have been codified in the city of Raleigh's rezoning conditions, and these conditions will apply throughout the course of development, which CANE estimates will be 15 to 20 years.
Thank you. This is another question that's on the hog waste issues. What solutions do you endorse for the hog waste issues?
You know what the problem is, the industrial hog waste. We aren't talking the family farms. Now, once upon a time, they were smaller farms and they could contain the hog waste. But when you get to these larger companies, which, oh, by the way, aren't necessarily located in the United States, their owners, you know who they are. They don't have nothing. They have no dog in this fight, and so they do things to get rid of their waste by using these spray fields. What I talked about before. They don't always follow their permits because we have tried to get legislation and rules through the state to hopefully tap down on some of this runoff that goes into the river basins. And it's hard to say because, you know, the Lumber River has CAFOs, the Cape Fear River has CAFOs, and depending on where they are in the geography of the land, they have a little bit different requirements. It's the larger companies that need to adhere to existing rules and regulations. And while I talked about hog waste, don't forget poultry waste, because poultry waste is just as bad, if not worse, because they don't require permits. In some cases, we don't even know where they are. Okay. We find out after somebody complains about it, and that's a problem.
You mentioned the Cape Fear River, and this question says, we've heard about fish kills in the Cape Fear River, but never seem to get causation info. Are the problems always related to pollution in Brunswick County and coal ash ponds? And is the data hidden at times from the public? It seems difficult to stay informed.
I've not seen any massive fish kills on the Cape Fear River recently. And that's a question I would probably tell you to talk to Kent Burnett, who is our Cape Fear River keeper, who's also, by the way, an environmental justice warrior. I call him my EJ brother. Here in Southeastern North Carolina, we formed a bit of a coalition of our groups because, as I told you, there's strength in numbers. And so if you have the North Carolina Coastal Federation with its 11,000 members, and Cape Fear River Watch with its members, and the Sierra Club with its members, and the local NAACP affiliates and their members, and we all start calling our local elected officials in Raleigh, that gets attention a lot more than just you or me. But is it always pollution? No, there are algae blooms. There's all kinds of things that affect the quality of water that could upset the ecosystem. I'm the poli-sci major. I'm not the hard scientist. So that's where I'm going to leave it right there. But again, I would tell you to go to the Cape Fear River Watch's website. They have a lot of good information on both CAFOs and concentrated animal feeding operations, as well as what they're doing to try to be the protectors. And they do a very good job of it, of our Cape Fear River. The environmental groups who do talk to one another in our region, because we have to, we sometimes will let other groups take the lead, and we'll be their backups, or through amicus briefs, or telling our volunteers to go help out with a project, or sending letters to support their projects. And that's important. You notice initially that It took 3 lawsuits to get the whole thing taken care of. In the first county that had this problem in Warren County. And so you want to position yourself as an environmental group because you have limited, you're a nonprofit, you have limited funds. You want to position whoever is going to have the best standing in court to take this, if possible, if necessary, up the judicial system. And so for hog farms, that would be the Cape Fear River Watch.
I'm going to combine these last 2 questions because I think both of you can look at these from different perspectives. The first question is, it appears that Raleigh and Wake County were late to the party for the early efforts of the cleanup. And the second question is, if North Carolina is the birthplace of environmental justice movement, how do we now compare to other states in terms of environmental justice? So I'm hearing in these 2 questions, Raleigh and Wake County seem to be a little slow in getting involved in these efforts. And then how do we as a state compare to other states, if that's the case?
Well, I can address the question regarding Raleigh and Wake County. Residents that live in Rochester Heights, particularly the longtime residents, were, of claim for a long time that, the city was not helpful in kind of addressing some of the environmental injustices, and particularly the flooding issues. And so it's not that there wasn't an awareness, and this probably applies across the board, in a lot of other places where there are environmental injustices going on. It's not as though some of the powers that be aren't aware that there's a problem. It's a lot of times there's a lack of will for them to help address the problem or bring resources to address the problem, because they're marginalized communities and they have little to no political capital, economic capital, or anything else. So that seems to be, from my limited understanding of environmental justice issues broadly, that's a common denominator. So yeah, those are my thoughts about that.
And I'll piggyback off of that. The political will at the state level, depending on who is sitting in the governor's seat, switches and changes and turns. And also, of course, our legislature makes the laws and the governor signs them. If the people who are in the General Assembly are not fans of ensuring and being intentional about making sure that every resident in North Carolina gets to enjoy environmental and climate justice, then we're going to fight. And we're still fighting. We're learning. I give Administrator Regan kudos. I don't always agree with the things he did when he was here in North Carolina. I probably think he should have done more in some cases. I understood, though, politically why sometimes that wasn't possible. But I give him credit for at least coming up with an advisory board, because that put the attention on environmental justice or injustice. He is being very intentional at the federal level, at EPA, with putting the focus back on environmental justice. When we were fighting here in southeastern North Carolina against a cement company, Titan Cement, that wanted to set up shop right on the already impaired Cape Fear River. They need lots of water and they have lots of waste. We went to the state, and at the time, the state, under a different governor and administration, wasn't that interested in helping us. Okay, there was no EJ and Equity Board. They're frankly the person who was in charge of environmental justice for the state and DEQ. It was like an additional duty for them. So, they had their main job that they had to worry about. And then somebody called on this, maybe they could get to it. So that's how we ended up with EPA Region 4, because at that time, the federal government was very intentional and very focused on it. So we're like, okay, we tried to talk to you. Now we'll go down to Atlanta and talk to them. And initially, I have to tell you, they weren't necessarily that interested. So a few of us got together and we went and saw the EPA Environmental Justice guy. And DC, and at the time his name is Mustafa Ali. And we said, we have a problem, not just in our state, but we have a problem with your region. So you might want to talk to them because they don't seem very interested in taking care of this. Now, when I got all bold and said that, I had a retired Department of Justice lawyer sitting with me and a lawyer from the Duke Environmental Law Center. So I could be all kinds of like, yeah, I got lawyers here. They're telling me we can fight this in court. So you might want to get your folks down in Atlanta a little interested. They got really interested after that. So now as a state, we could probably learn a little bit from Virginia, believe it or not. The Commonwealth has done a lot on EJ. Their EJ advisory board actually gets to talk to the governor. We're not quite there yet. We are literally, we advise the secretary, whoever that is, and we don't exist by rules or regulations or by law. It was mentioned I was on the Coastal Resources Commission. That's by law. That commission exists out of the Coastal Area Management Act. You know, so it has some oomph to it. We're not quite at that oomph yet. We need citizens to show their legislators that they care and they want this to be intentional and that they want people to focus on this. People as in legislators who have money and can make rules and regulations and codes, things that can be enforced, things that can be permitted, things that you can say, no, you can't do this because in North Carolina, that's against the law. That's what we need. My humble opinion. Mine, not EJ and Equity Board, not the town of Leland, Veronica Carter's. That disclaimer. I'm learning to be a good politician.
That's all the questions that we have for now, and it's all the time that we have as well. I want to thank you both so much. Your presentations were very different, and yet the call to encouragement and getting involved and staying involved came from both of you loud and clear, and we appreciate all of the resources that you gave us to get us started if we're not, some of us, already there. I would like to close out this presentation and let everyone know that this is our last Timely Topics for this season. And you can view this on YouTube on the LWV-Wake YouTube channel. And September will be our next Timely Topic. So please stay connected to the League for all of the events and news and updates through our newsletter and through our website. And I'd like to ask our presenters to just remain here for a few minutes while our attendees leave, and then we can close things out. And I'll turn this over to Cheryl Tung. Thank you so much again.
Great, thank you. And that ends our program tonight. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending.